last time we were on, we began 1 Corinthians 7. We didn't quite get to the end of it. And then we're going to go, I hope, into 8 today. Chapter 8 is a short chapter, only 13 verses. So this section as a whole, I think last time I got too into the weeds with you guys on some kind of detailed stuff that has to do with, how biblical scholars are approaching these texts. And, it really doesn't matter in a sense, because the debate among the scholars is basically how do we reconstruct what the situation on the ground was in Corinth. And like I keep saying, we're only hearing half of the conversation. So a lot of scholars get really interested in trying to reconstruct what it was that was actually happening in Corinth, what it was they wrote to Paul, when is Paul quoting what they're saying, etc. And this can get really technical, but the upshot of it is, even though there are some kind of different ideas circulating now, the upshot doesn't really change the meaning of the text. So I want to just review just the broad meaning of the text for us. So, in chapter 7, he's starting to deal, and he starts with, now concerning the things of which you wrote to me. So he's dealing point by point now with some issues. And in chapter 7 and then chapter 8, this unit, he's going to talk basically about 3 controversial things. One, there's an issue of sexuality and marriage. 2, then he touches briefly on slavery, which seems kind of a bit of an aside, but is actually connected. And then in chapter 8, he goes into this issue of eating meat sacrificed to idols. Now, I think the first thing we got to keep in mind is when we're dealing with this kind of sexual immorality and eating meat sacrificed to idols, which a light bulb should go off on our heads, that if we remember back to Acts, these were the 2 big issues. So Paul, remember in Acts, Paul's going around to these Gentile communities, he's creating Christian communities, and this issue comes up about Jewishness, how Jewish do you have to be Christian? And the council in Acts 15 finally decides that that they're going back to Leviticus, the holiness code. They're looking at all this, the holiness code that God gave to Moses for the Israelites. He would say, go and tell the sons of Israel X, go and tell the sons of Israel Y. And that's another interesting issue, the sons of Israel, because the covenant with God in the old Jewish model was basically through the man, and women participated in that covenant through their man. Right, that's another issue that comes up. But in that Leviticus holiness code, there are a couple places where God says that these following rules apply to the sons of Israel and anyone who dwells in the land, any foreigners who dwell in the land with you, because these sins pollute the land itself, and you can't tolerate this. So, and what are those? Remember, sexual immorality and idolatry, which was connected with meat. So we can't eat meat with blood in it, and we can't eat meat sacrificed to idols, because that's participating in idolatry. These were really the 2 things: idolatry, eating food associated with idolatry, and sexual immorality. And it's no coincidence, these are the exact 2 issues that seem very problematic in Corinth. So we have here, we have the church's teaching, we have in Acts 15 this kind of ruling that this is what's going to be required of Gentile converts. Now, the interesting thing is here that Paul, in his application of this rule, is going to allow what we as Orthodox would call economia, which is to kind of, how can I say, to a loosening of the rules in view of the salvation of the persons or individual concrete persons who are involved in the situation, meaning that the rules aren't always strictly enforced, but that we have in mind the ultimate salvation of the people involved, which may mean doing away with the rules for a time. So it's really interesting here, especially with the meat sacrificed to idols, Paul's attitude, and then compare that with what's going on in Acts 15. And then this leads to a whole bunch of questions of chronology. So when exactly is Paul writing this to Corinth? Is it before the events recorded in Acts 15? So before this decision was finally made, and here Paul is offering his own kind of temporary solution, or has that decision already been made and Paul is kind of pulling back from it? There's all kinds of questions, but the key for us here is they're asking him a question about marriage. So he's going to break down in chapter 7 into different groups. talking about, for example, those who are already married, those who are already married to a Christian, fellow Christian, those who are married to a non-Christian, those who have never been married, those who are divorced. And so you got to keep in mind these different groups. But in this beginning section here, I just wanted to highlight again the takeaway for us as Christians today. And that is really not in dispute. And the Lenten retreat that we have coming up in about 2 weeks is about the Orthodox phronema, Orthodox way of thinking, right? The mind, acquiring the mind of Christ. And I think what's really going on here is that Paul is really manifesting this, or what we would call this Orthodox way of thinking. That's not, it's a different way of thinking. It's not necessarily what we would call rational. It can't be neatly categorized into black and white categories. And so I think this makes it hard for us modern Westerners to understand what he's saying, but it's a classic Orthodox answer. Instead of, when you had the Protestant Reformation in the West, and Western Christianity breaks in two, and they start fighting back and forth about faith versus works, these different dichotomies. And then they would turn to the Orthodox on occasions throughout the last few hundred years and say, well, what do the Orthodox say? Is it faith or is it works? And we would say yes, and it's both. So this is the typical kind of Orthodox answer, but it's hard for others to understand. So what's Paul say here? He says, verse 2, nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, or actually immoralities, plural, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. So what's he probably talking about here? The most likely scenario in this section, because he's talking about married couples withholding marital relations from each other. And the most likely scenario here is that there are married couples in the community where one partner or the other is choosing out of a sense of piety to fast and to refrain from marital relations for a time, and that this is causing sexual immoralities. So the most likely scenario, from what we know about Greco-Roman culture, we talked about this before, very different attitude towards sex, that it was just this kind of natural function, like blowing your nose or something. And so what was common was, and probably what's happening here, is that if the wife was withholding marital relations from the husband, then he was being tempted to these sexual immoralities, in which it was common in the Greco-Roman world for a man to just stop off at a brothel, right? So he would stop off at the brothel, he would take care of his bodily physical urges, and that was it. Paul, of course, is saying this is not acceptable in the Christian realm, right? So he's saying because of these sexual immoralities, these temptations that are happening, probably especially to the men, he's saying, you guys need to think about this differently. So here's what, there's some great quotes from St. John Chrysostom, who kind of really explains what this section means for us. He says, and this is the traditional interpretation, I'm sure, I'd be interested, those of you who maybe grew up in a Baptist background, if what it's, I believe this is the interpretation you probably got also. So St. John Chrysostom says, the wife does not have power over her own body, but is both the servant and the mistress of the husband. Now remember, St. Paul's going to say the other way too, so don't jump to conclusions. He continues, if you reject this, you have offended God, he says. But if you want to withdraw yourself sexually, it should only be with your husband's permission, and then only for a short time. In other parts of Scripture, the husband is given certain prerogatives in marriage, but not here. Where chastity is concerned, husband and wife have equal rights. All right, so, but now the next one is going to clarify it more. Chrysostom says, great evils spring from this sort of continence if it is overdone. Continence meaning refraining from marital relations. Great evils spring from this if it's overdone. Adulteries, fornications, and the destruction of families have often resulted from this, from married couples withholding marital relations from each other. If a married man commits fornication, this example, it's probably in view in Corinth, where the man went to a brothel or a prostitute. If a married man commits fornication, how much more will he do so if his wife denies herself to him? Unless there is mutual consent, continence in this case is really a form of theft, So he's saying to both, partners, that withholding marital relations can lead the other into temptation. And for that reason, it's not good. So, this is really the highlight of what Paul is trying to get at. He's not saying one or the other is, I think the modern debate has come down to these like two extremes. Like either Paul is super ascetic and he wants everybody to be just like him, or no, he's not ascetic at all and he wants everyone to have, much more sex. I mean, I think this is a product of our own time, our own way of approaching it. I think what Paul is saying is it's a very practical teaching and application. He's saying, it would be good if both partners, choose for a time to be chaste and to devote themselves to prayer and reading scripture. That is a wonderful and good thing. But he's warning them, be careful, because there's going to be some temptation involved here if you overdo it, right? So you have to proceed cautiously, because yes, it's good to have this kind of piety and deepening, for example, as we do during Lent, where we enter into a more ascetic way of living and try to focus more on the spiritual. But he's warning there's a lot of danger here too. You can make good progress spiritually, but don't overdo it. And then here, St. Augustine, and on this issue of sexual relations, he's played quite a role, unfortunately. But sometimes he has some good stuff. And he says on this passage, this section, according to this, if the husband had wished to practice continence, but you, the wife, had not, he would have been obliged to give in to you. And God would have given him credit for continence, for not refusing intercourse out of consideration for your weakness, not his own, in order to prevent you from committing adultery. How much better would it have been for you, the wife, Augustine says, for whom subjection was more appropriate, to yield to his will in rendering him the debt? And here's the important part. Since God would have taken account of your intention to observe continence, which you gave up in order to save your husband from destruction. All right, does that make sense? So he's saying, in other words, you had this godly intention to have a period of abstinence and fasting so that you could pray and devote yourself more fully to the Lord. That is wonderful and good. But if that desire of yours endangers him because he doesn't consent to this period of abstinence, then in reality, you're not doing anything good. You're contributing to his destruction. So instead, you should think, God will honor my heart's intention. God sees my heart's intention, and then he sees my willingness to martyr my own will, to kind of swallow my own desires, suppress my own desires in order to do what is going to be good for us as a team, right? In order to prevent a husband's destruction by leading him inadvertently into some kind of temptation that he can't resist, right? Does this make sense of this section? All right. So, all right. So the interesting part here. So like on verse 5, it says, do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. All right. So then the question is, well, what is he conceding? Is he conceding, okay, you can have a little sex, or is he conceding, okay, you can fast a little bit? That's where the debate comes. But it's really, last time I think I confused things by getting too deep into that. The real question for us, we don't know what exactly was the situation on the ground, but the key for us is Paul is urging a kind of nuance, right? It's not one or the other. He's urging a kind of nuance. And then the other thing that's hard for us to understand is he's not denigrating really one or the other. He's saying this is good and this is good. Or he might say, this is the best, but if you can't do that, if you haven't been given this gift to do that by God, then this is good also, and you don't sin, right? So this is kind of the Orthodox way of thinking. So I bring this up because there was actually a debate. A lot of times when we're reading the Gospels or Paul, these issues come up, and to us, maybe they seem strange, but then if you look back, historically, these were live issues that we have other evidence of being discussed around that same time. So, for example, in the school of the Pharisees around Jesus's time, the Pharisees also had two schools, Hillel and Shammai. These were the two kind of famous schools, conservative, liberal, maybe you could say. But they had a debate about this question: how long could couples abstain from sexual relations? This is what the rabbis discussed in Jesus' time. One school said, and these are the Pharisees, strict. One school said it could be up to 1 week, but no more. And one school said it could be up to 2 weeks, but no more. So anyway, this kind of the question about this was in the air for the Jews, and then in a very different way for the Greco-Roman, the Gentile culture, because for them, again, sex was viewed differently. It didn't really there was no kind of ethical component for them. Even their gods engaged in all kinds of strange, sexual behavior and their human forms. So very different. But for the Gentiles, they viewed when they would see Jews or Christians who are able to abstain or control their sexual desires and not go to prostitutes and not, or even not be kind of led by the nose by their sexual desires, but exert some kind of self-control. Many of the Gentiles, especially the educated philosophical ones, were impressed. They would be like, "Oh my gosh, this is like superhuman! Like, who can control the sexual urge?" Right? It was very difficult for them to, they viewed it as like a kind of a superhero or something, someone who had all this self-control. All right, so that's this first part that we covered last time, up through the first 20 verses. All right, and then here, so then he said, then in this section, live as you are called. This is where he touches on the slavery issue. Now, why does he get into the issue of slavery when he's in the middle of discussing marriage and sexual relations in marriage? So, basically because this is the connection in his mind. But as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, and this is a phrase that he keeps repeating in this letter: calling, you're calling, you're calling. As the Lord has called each one, let him walk. So in other words, he's recognizing this diversity of gifts that God gives. And this is going to come up again later in the beautiful passage in chapters 12 and 13, when he's talking about the various parts of the body of Christ and how each needs the other, etc. But he's emphasizing there's a diversity of gifts. So you have to focus on what was your calling. What is it that God is calling you to do in coordination with, in conjunction with other people in the body of Christ? And how can you work together? So in other words, Paul is saying that all this is a matter of gifting, right? He wishes all men were as he was, which means he was celibate. But he recognizes, as the Orthodox Church has always recognized, that this is a gift. It's not something that can be forced. And if you go to monasteries today, sometimes there will be younger people, young men and women who want to try out the monastic life. And there's a period of discernment. And oftentimes, the already existing monks or nuns will tell them, I don't think, this is your calling. I think maybe you were called to the married life, and this is good. And this is good. What's good is for each person to do what they were called to do. That's what's good. So if you are called to be celibate so that you could focus more completely on the things of the Lord, that is wonderful. That is a gift, and that's your calling, and you should embrace that. But if it's not your gift, and your gift is for marriage, then you should embrace that. And that's also good. He's not saying one's bad or the other. And it avoids these kind of extremes. Like in the Catholic Church, famously, there was always a difference in the East and the West. Between the West always kind of emphasized, maybe from about the 4th or 5th century, the celibacy of the clergy, all the clergy, the bishops and the priests. Whereas in the East, it was just the bishops, and the priests could choose to be married, or they could choose to be celibate. This is a choice in our tradition you have to make before you're ordained. And then once you're ordained, you're kind of sealed there. You're either a married priest or you're a monk priest, not married. And both are good. In the Orthodox Church, there was an interesting statistic about this. From what we can tell, in the Orthodox Church across the world, in Greece, for example, that 97% of Orthodox priests are married. 3% of Orthodox priests are not married, right? So in the Catholic Church, of course, it's 100%, from 3 to 100%. So in our view, we would say that perhaps this is more reflective of the actual callings, right? That seems reasonable that 3% of Orthodox men who become priests, 3% have this special calling, this special gift, and they have the desire to walk in that path. And then that's blessed for them. And that's good. And Paul wishes it all were like he, but it's not bad by any means. It's also good to fulfill your gift as married, but you have to discern. So this is what he's saying here. And this is the connection with slavery, right? It's because then in the next verse, he says, was anyone called, again, this calling, but here he means called to become a Christian while circumcised, meaning while already a Jew? Let him not become uncircumcised. We talked about this procedure that would reverse the signs of circumcision that was important in the Hellenistic world, because you exercised in the nude at the gymnasium, and it was a bit of a stigma to be circumcised. And then he says circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. So, and now remember, just like we were saying about the sexual immorality and the idolatry, eating meat, sacrificed idols, these were core issues at the time. Here he's talking about circumcision. Circumcision is another core issue to Judaism. I mean, this isn't some extraneous secondary issue. This is a core issue. I mean, especially in Paul's time, circumcision was and the keeping of the dietary laws were the two main identifiers of you as a Jewish person, as a Jewish male. So this was extremely important to your religious identity. And Paul is saying it doesn't matter at all. It's totally irrelevant, he's saying. I mean, just try to imagine the weight of what he's saying. I mean, to a Jew, it would be almost inconceivable. But he's saying, all these things are nothing. Focus on what you were called to do. So in other words, if you were called in the state where you were circumcised, stay that way. If you were called uncircumcised, stay that way. And then he's going to talk about slavery. But why is he saying that? Because his emphasis is on going back to marriage. He prefers that in view of the present distress, as he says elsewhere, it's better for everyone to stay as they are. Whatever the station you are, don't, just accept where you are, because the Lord is coming again soon. This is what Paul believed. Now, some people will say, well, Paul was wrong in retrospect. The Lord, wasn't coming soon. And so therefore, his kind of perspective needs to be modified a little bit in light of the fact that Christ hasn't returned yet, et cetera. But, we would say that's not the correct way of looking at it, that yes, it's true that Christ hasn't returned yet out of his mercy, but Paul, it's not like he was wrong. He lived in that expectation, that imminent expectation that the Lord was near, that he was coming soon. And we are all called to live like that, not to assume that we have tomorrow to repent or to straighten our ways, but to live with this kind of imminent expectation that the Lord will reveal himself again soon. So this is kind of like the connection throughout this passage with the slavery, because here he says, let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is, so he's not saying it's bad to do one thing. He's saying, don't worry about it. In other words, he's prioritizing all these things that are important to us in a worldly sense, or to the Corinthians. They were very concerned with their social status, right? And it was conventional for conventional Jews to be concerned that they were a free male Jew who's circumcised. Paul's saying, stop worrying about all this stuff. This is all secondary. Focus on the Lord who is going to return soon. So, and then he says, for he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who was called while free is Christ's slave, right? So he's saying, all these distinctions are kind of, if we focus only in a worldly sense on these distinctions of free and slave, which we're going to see later in this epistle are a big problem in Corinth, then we've misunderstood Christianity. All of us are called to be free in Christ, and all of us are called to be a slave in Christ. So and why? You are bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. You are bought at a price by Christ's sacrifice on the cross. So brethren, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. So now he returns to another category of marriage, but the slavery was not a real big aside, because the point overall was stay as you are. Don't, but in general, but if something comes up, if you're a slave, be happy with where you are. Try to make the best of your situation. But if you have a chance to be free, take it. That's good too. But don't worry about it. In other words, now he's saying, now this final category we're going to get to in 25 is concerning those who have never married, right? This is the final category. Before, he was talking about people who are currently married or people who were divorced, which was common in the Hellenistic world. I got any questions? I'll take a breath here. Any questions? I should just say that too about the slavery issue, that you are bought with a price. There's some interesting research on this. So the most recent research, again, this goes to the scholars who are always trying to reconstruct what the community in Corinth looked like, what exactly was going on. So the latest research suggests that perhaps 1/3 of the population in Corinth were slaves. So that of all the people, and not just the Christian community, but the people in general of Corinth, which was a major city, that 1/3 of them approximately would have currently been slaves, and that another 1/3 had experienced slavery at some time in their lives, but at this point now had been freed, right? So that's 2/3 of the whole population of Corinth that either currently are or were slaves. And this is kind of evidence, it's not that Corinth was particularly unique in this way, but just to give us an idea what the makeup was. So this issue of slavery would have touched, it wasn't a theoretical, hypothetical issue, it was real. But interestingly, in the Greco-Roman world, there was this process called, even before Christianity, there was this process called sacral manumission. And it was basically they would go to a temple of one of the pagan gods. For example, famously at Delphi, the Pythian Apollo, the Pythian Apollo at Delphi, the oracle at Delphi. There at Delphi at the temple, the priest of Delphi, of Apollo, who had previously received the amount of the purchase price from the slave or friends of the slave. All right, so let's say there was a slave who had, perhaps this was common, earned enough money on his own to buy his own freedom, or perhaps he had some friends who were going to buy his freedom. And that we have evidence that this was happening in associations and groups like Christianity, where a group of the group, those who are wealthier in the group, would actually pool funds in order to buy the freedom of members of the group who are still slaves. So, and we have evidence this was what was happening in early Christian communities too. The Christians who could would chip in to buy the freedom of fellow Christians who were slaves. And then, of course, there's some evidence that there was some abuse of this system, perhaps people becoming Christian in order to get people to help them buy their freedom, etc. But even in the pagan world before Christianity, so the slave would go to the priest at Delphi or to a pagan priest of a temple. The money would be given to the priest to pay for the slave's freedom. The priest would, in other words, transfer the money from the slave and his friends to the slave's owner. And then a record of the emancipation was then inscribed on the walls of the temple. And thereafter, the slave was known as sacred or as a slave of that god or goddess, right? As a slave of Apollo. So in other words, it was a human interaction where someone bought their freedom, but they ran it through this religious prism so that it was through the god that their freedom was secured. The god was kind of like the guarantor of this deal between the owner and the slave. And that thereafter, because it took place under the aegis of this god, that they were a slave of that god. So then we see how the language of being a slave of Christ that Paul talks about, in this language of we were bought with a price, we were redeemed, right? All this language makes sense, not only in the Jewish context, but it would resonate among the Greeks as well. All right, so now 25. So now he says, now concerning virgins. So he means those who are not yet married, who have never been married. And he clarifies, because he's assumed in the background on this discussion on marriage, the words, the teachings of Jesus recorded in the Gospels about divorce, the reasons for the divorce. But here and he's always pretty careful to do this, to clarify when he has a direct commandment revealed to him by Christ and when he's just giving his opinion. So he's saying, and if you look at the history of the church, the great fathers of our church, they also do the same thing. Even a contemporary saint like Saint Paisios was always very careful to distinguish when he was saying something that was the authoritative teaching of the church, or when he was just offering his opinion on how to apply it. So here he's saying, I have no commandment from the Lord. I'm giving my opinion. Yet I give judgment, I give opinion as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. Elsewhere he says, I think I too have the Spirit, in other words. So I'm not saying this from a direct command from the Lord, but I'm giving you my kind of educated opinion and the Lord has appointed me to this position to make decisions, such as this. He's made me trustworthy and put me in this position as an apostle. I suppose, 26, I suppose therefore that it is good because of the present distress. This is the present distress, meaning that that we're at the end of time. And that was 2,000 years ago, but for the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, 1,000 years as a day. So he's talking about this present distress, meaning the end of time, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Remember, he just talked about this. Whatever your calling was, stay in that. Don't worry about other things. Are you bound to a wife? Meaning, this is a Jewish term. Are you married? Are you legally married? 27, are you legally married to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. In other words, do not attempt to dissolve the marriage. Are you loosed from a wife? Are you divorced from a wife? Do not seek a wife. Do not seek a new one. In other words, wherever you find yourself right now, be content there. 28, that's the best, he says. 28, but even if you do marry, you have not sinned. So it's this Orthodox thinking, like, this would be good if you can do it, but if you can't do it, this is good too, and you don't sin. So if you're not married, if you're currently divorced, I say don't seek a wife. Remain free so you can devote yourself entirely to the Lord, and the end is coming soon anyway. But he says, but if you can't do this, if you haven't been given the gift to do this, if you married, you've not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. Such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. A lot of times you hear pastors kind of quote or paraphrase this line about, the married life, that, if when we decide to get married, St. Paul tells us we're going to have troubles. Married life is not a continual 60-year honeymoon. I mean, you're going to have some troubles, and that's normal. And he says, I would spare you having these troubles in married life in view of the present distress. The world is coming to an end soon. We all need to get prepared, but you don't sin in doing that, So 29, but this I say, brethren, the time is short. Again, this emphasis on the eschaton, the end of time is coming. The time is short. Christ is coming again soon. So that from now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none. 30, those who weep as though they did not weep. Those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Those who buy as though they did not possess. And those who use this world as not misusing it. Now, this is a kind of strange translation. 31, and those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it, for the present form of the world is passing away. In other words, don't be so interested in worldly affairs, right? Because all of it's coming to an end anyway. Those who are happy now in this life, when the end comes and Christ makes all things new, it doesn't necessarily, they're happy now, but they'll mourn later. If you're mourning now because your lot in life is difficult, don't be anxious about it, because Christ is coming soon, and those who mourn will be those who rejoice with him. This world is passing away, so don't be so concerned about worldly forms. Everyone with me so far? All right. 32, but I want you to be without care, or I want you to be free from concern. I don't want you to be anxious about these things. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. There's a difference. All right, 34. There's a difference between a wife and a virgin. So the virgin, maybe we would translate it something like maiden, something like that, a young woman who hadn't been betrothed yet. There's a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman, the maiden, the virgin, cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. So he said the same thing about the husband. Now he says it for the wife. So it's equal in that way. And this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. So what's he talking about? Probably he's talking about here, when he's talking about this virgin, Parthenos, Parthenos, what he's probably talking about is, now in here again, it gets a little maybe controversial, but because it's hard to reconstruct, but it seems that already in this early time, there were people who were engaging in a kind of what we would call proto-monasticism, an early form of monasticism before it takes on its kind of an official form, right? And mainly it seems like we see the most evidence among women. So widows becomes kind of a technical term, like even when we get to like 1st and 2nd Timothy, already we can see when Paul uses the term widows, it has kind of a technical meaning, and meaning someone, probably literal widows, but widows then who were kind of embraced by the church community and supported by the church community. And in return, they devoted themselves fully to the life of the church, to ministering to others, etc. Does that make sense? So then, of course, there were some, again, abuses maybe of the system. Paul talks in the pastoral letters, 1st, 2nd Timothy, about women just, getting together and gossiping. You get the impression that, maybe these women who are being supported by the church to dedicate themselves as widows, pure to the Lord, ministering to others, that, maybe they're taking advantage of the situation and not engaging in all the work that they should be, etc. But so he's talking about this virgin, but probably in the sense of like, okay, the widows are the ones who lost their husbands and now have devoted themselves to the Lord. And here's a case where they were never married and they're devoting themselves to the Lord. This seems to be what's in mind, right? And he's saying that that this is good. He's saying this is good because it allows the unmarried person can focus fully on the Lord, but he's not saying that it's bad to be married. He's saying it depends on your calling. What were you called to do? Now, this is another part where there's some confusion about what Paul means exactly. 36, but if any man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. All right, let's see what the other translations offer here. Okay, here, 36. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes, right? So here on 30, this interpretation from the RSV assumes that if a man has a fiance, a man has a fiance, and he's saying if he's not behaving properly toward his fiance, if his passions are strong, he's talking about sexual desire, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes, let them marry, it is no sin. All right, that's kind of the newer way of reading this. The traditional way of reading it is that the man is the father, he is behaving improperly toward his virgin means his maiden daughter. If she is, so here it says that it's his fiance. Here they're interpreting as his daughter. Here it says if his passions are strong, and here it translates it as if she is past the flower of youth, right? So these are the two words that are being interpreted totally differently, right? So I'll show you here. Idetis askimonin. So askimonin means if someone is acting in an inappropriate, ugly way, in a shameful, disgraceful way, concerning, where won't that go away? concerning his epitin parthenon aftu, nomisi ean hyperakmos. So if someone is acting shamefully toward his virgin, thinking that she is hyperakmos. So this is the troublesome word here, hyperakmos. It's kind of a rare word, and it can mean two different things. The first meaning is hyper means like super or beyond, right? And akmos is acme, right? So super acme. If she is beyond the peak, super acme, beyond the peak, and it's keutos ophili and it ought to be the man, and if he wants, go ahead and get married. But the problem is with this hyperakmos means, so does it mean that she's beyond what does it say here? That she is beyond the flower of youth. In other words, is she beyond her sexual prime, let's say? In other words, is she a little long in the tooth, maybe they would say? And this all assumes the system in which the father was the one who had ultimate authority to marry his wife, to marry his daughter off, right? He was the one basically who had the final say on these arranged marriages. Everything was an arranged marriage. Or does it mean, hyperakmos could mean, not as commonly, but it could mean hypersexual, right? So either she's kind of beyond the prime when normally these young women would be betrothed and get married, or now they're interpreting this as he is hypersexual, then they can get married. So that's why you get these two totally different translations. But the traditional translation of all the Greek fathers, of all the early fathers of the church, is that when it says marry, it means it's net, that word gamizo, to marry, is never used in the sense of I'm marrying my wife. It's always used in the sense of to marry off. So I would marry off my daughter, right? It's never ever used in any other sense. So the Greek fathers, who knew Greek much better than any of us, and even the biblical scholars, they say he's talking about a father who has a daughter who is perhaps now a little bit older. Traditionally, she would already have been betrothed and married off. But probably what's happening here is that because of this, the widows dedicated themselves to the Lord, and there were these young women who were dedicating themselves to the Lord and choosing permanent chastity, choosing not to get married, that if a father, in conjunction with the desires of his daughter, decided, you know what, I'm not going to marry her off, I'm going to let her continue in her service to the Lord, that's okay, he's saying. They're so kind of committed as Christians, as a Christian family, that they want to devote themselves entirely to the Lord and prepare for his imminent coming. And you don't want to betroth your daughter. That's not bad. So now this was like, I think this is hard for us to understand how countercultural this was. I mean, this was revolutionary. The idea that a woman could have any say in consenting to be married. I mean, it's just unheard of. I mean, they were simply treated as, property, basically. The father would make advantageous marriage arrangements that would help the family, and no one thought anything differently about it. But Christianity really introduces, I was listening to one argument actually recently that was saying that Christianity is actually responsible for the Me Too movement. Okay, so this is an interesting line of argument, that it was only Christianity that brought this idea into the ancient world, that women had any choice whatsoever, and especially monasticism, even in its earlier incipient forms here or later, was a kind of privilege given to women that they never enjoyed in the ancient world. That they had the power to say, no, I'm not getting married. I mean, and you see this in all these lives of the early women saints, that they were tortured, they were harassed because some governor, some pagan official desired them for their beauty and their family and their wealth and their nobility or whatever, and they just absolutely refused to marry the person, even suffering tortures, sometimes alienating their family if the family maybe wasn't Christian. I mean, this was a huge issue, like that these women were asserting that they could say no and that they had control over their own bodies. I mean, unbelievable, totally countercultural. We just assume this, right? Because we have inherited this Christian culture over 2,000 years. So, yeah.
I can't help thinking of Saint Thecla when before you even mentioned the women and so on that had heard Saint Paul and followed him, even dressed as a man, in order that she may hide herself and then go and actually preach herself. And I just kept thinking about her. We don't hear of Saint Thecla in this part of the world, but Saint Thecla is very revered in the Middle East, and their church is even named after Saint Thecla. And so she's one of the earliest saints that left home and family to follow Saint Paul and listen to his preaching. And one of my questions here was, do we know exactly when the monastic system for women really began? Did it begin after Saint Anthony began his monastic tradition, monasticism? Did the women come after that, or do we know that there were women who abstained before that and congregated as a congregation of nuns? And
this is another big debate. I mean, anytime we get into questions of like, this just drives me crazy about, especially here in America, every week there are 3 new Christian denominations being created here in America. There's 40,000 different Christian denominations. And a lot of them, where was I going with this? Where was I going? Say the question again. I'm still recovering. I'm still in this.
Trying to say, my question was, do we know how early the women who actually became convents and nuns, was it after the birth of monasticism, which was started supposedly by Saint Anthony in the deserts of Egypt, and then women started to actually have convents and so on, and monasticism? Or do we know earlier than that, like Saint Thecla and so on, what happened to people like her? And did she have a following among the women themselves? And we look at the story of Phoebe, we look at the story of and all these women that became followers of Paul in the early stages, whether they became, in a sense, abstained and from sexual immorality or whatever.
So where I was going was, so you have all these, especially here in America, these new groups, Christian denominations constantly popping up, and the kind of recurring theme in all of them is that they're all seeking to reclaim early Christianity, all seeking to reclaim New Testament Christianity, first century Christianity. These are kind of the buzzwords they use, right? The problem is, as a biblical scholar, there's, in the first century, especially the first 100 years, it is very difficult to say almost anything with absolute certainty, right? So here we get into all kinds of debates. The tradition of the church historically and even today is that, yes, we see evidence reflected in the scripture and also tradition, that extra biblical tradition, that there was this kind of early form of monasticism. It didn't look like what it looks like later coming from the 4th century, but there was this idea of people who were set apart in some way for full kind of service to the Lord. And it definitely involved this kind of choice of chastity or virginity, which was always praised by the Christians and which the pagans marveled at. I mean, like, how could, it was just shocking to them. How could a man control his sexual impulses? How could a woman have be so bold as to say, no, I'm not going to get married. I'm not going to be treated as property. So, yeah, we would say, and I think there's pretty good evidence, but I can't prove that there was this kind of idea, early form of monasticism. And I would say that's the consensus among Christian history scholars, but then we don't see it start to take official form until maybe like the 4th century, because usually the kind of standard explanation of this is that once you get to the 4th century and you have the legalization of Christianity, so you go from maybe 6% of the Roman Empire's population was Christian, in 100 years it goes to maybe like 96%, right? So this huge jump, and you have the end of the persecutions. So then there's this move, you have this whole influx of, how can I put this? I mean, so before that, you had anyone who was a Christian, it was pretty safe to say they were pretty committed to being a Christian, because there wasn't really an advantage. It was actually a distinct disadvantage to be a Christian, right? So it implied a level of commitment to the Lord. Whereas afterwards, when you have everyone becoming Christian, now you're going to have, as we continue to see throughout the centuries, even to this day, in each and every parish, you have some people who are, very firmly committed to a Christian life. You have some people who are kind of nominally Christian, right? Just kind of in name, maybe they do observe some things. So the usual explanation is that once this happens, that this really propels monasticism, because then you have people who are still seeking this kind of higher level of commitment and engagement with the Lord. Does that make sense? So then the whole question of Thecla is really fascinating, because there's a big debate among biblical scholars about Paul. And basically you have the pastoral letters, which is first and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And you have the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which is not in the New Testament, Acts of Paul and Thecla, which is a written document, probably from the 2nd century, very early, fascinating to read. You can read it online on this site called earlychristianwritings.org, which has this like compilation of all these writings from the first few centuries. But it presents a really kind of different picture of Paul. In the Acts of Paul and Thecla, Paul is more of a kind of ascetic, more of a revolutionary, pushing for, women's ability to choose virginity, etc., which was very countercultural. And then in the pastoral epistles, you get a kind of maybe a different view of Paul, where he's not ascetic as much. He's telling Timothy, you got to drink a little wine for your stomach, and where he's, so it prevents kind of two different angles on Paul. So this whole idea of, Thecla was a really important figure in the early church, because she represented this kind of, for people who admired her, she was someone they looked up to as someone fully devoted to the Lord, who was this strong woman. She baptized herself. I mean, it's just an incredible story. She went and evangelized with Paul as like an equal. This was unheard of in the Greco-Roman world. But for some people, she represented kind of a danger that, we can't have these independent women running around like this. I mean, we can't have everyone becoming like Thecla and refusing to get married, because the empire will collapse, etc. So there was this real kind of debate there. All right, anyway, I'm gonna try to finish. Let's just finish 7, and the next time we can do 8. All right, so if she has passed the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry, or let him marry her off. In other words, yeah. So, all right. Nevertheless, 37. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. So in other words, if you're a father and you have this daughter who, as a family, she consents and you consent that she's going to devote herself to the Lord, you're not going to marry her off. She's getting a little bit older, past the prime now, where you would have the chance, let's say, to marry her off. And if, she starts to, say like, I don't know if this is my calling anymore. I would like to get married. I'd like to have children. I'm almost past my childbearing age here. Paul's saying the father doesn't do anything wrong by marrying her off. It's not like he's giving in to the devil or anything like this. Marriage is a fine and wonderful thing, but it's also good if he is resolved in his heart that all of them are going to be deeply committed to Christ, and she's for this, that she wants to remain celibate so she can fully devote herself to the Lord. If he's resolved this in his heart, that this is the commitment he wants to make to the Lord, and it's not out of necessity, it's not out of some force, but out of his own free will, then that's good too. That's wonderful. Both are good. All right. So then it concludes in 38. So he's concluding, he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. Right. So he's showing his preference all throughout this chapter. He's showing it's pretty clear that his preference is, if focus on your calling, stay as you are, that if you're not married, don't rush to be married necessarily, because it's going to be easier for you. You're not going to have so many troubles. The Lord is coming soon. You can fully devote yourself to the Lord. So this would save you the most trouble, right? But you don't sin if you do decide to get married. It's not working for the devil or anything like that. This is also blessed by God. This is the Orthodox Church phronema that the church always teaches. The Orthodox Church always teaches there are two and only two paths to salvation. It's either marriage or celibacy, marriage or celibacy, right? So monogamy or celibacy. Those are the two choices. Both are blessed. If you choose to be a monk, that is a wonderful thing. If you choose to be married, that's a wonderful thing. Both can lead you to salvation. And if you have contact with the monasteries, which here in America, unfortunately, don't have a very strong monastic tradition, like in traditionally Orthodox countries, where it's a real option, like in Greece, population of 10 million, median state, they have 1,000 active monasteries in Greece, 1,000. So everyone has someone in their family, a cousin, a nephew, or something who's a monk or a nun. It's some people are given that gift, and the society is structured in such a way that there's a legitimate option for those people with that gift and that calling to go fulfill that in a monastery. Here in the U.S., I think our culture's Protestantized, so monasticism has really been shunned. There's an anti-monastic movement in Protestantism, an anti-clericalism in Protestantism that we really don't, our society doesn't even view that as a gift that God gives, right? In effect, we don't, as a Christian society, we don't acknowledge that that's even a possible gift for God to give, celibacy. We've just totally written it off in Protestant theology. But then we're accused of denigrating marriage, and that by emphasizing or offering monasticism as an option. This is a false dichotomy. They're setting up a straw man argument. That's not what we're saying. That's not what Paul's saying here. He's saying that some people have been given this gift of celibacy, and that for those people, they should pursue it. And by implication, that we should encourage those people to support that, to pursue that, if that's their calling. It does exist, but the percentages we talked about, where of all the priests, 3% are celibate, so it means that a small percentage of people have this gift, but we should allow it. In our society, we don't. That's not an option. If a young girl would be inclined in that way, this doesn't even have the resources and the culture to even think about it as a possibility. Right. All right. 39. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. So now he's dealing with another category. So if you're married, if a woman is married, then she should stay married to her husband. She should not seek to divorce him. But if he dies, which, even in our time, this is usual that the husband dies first, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. So he means to another Christian, to a believer. She cannot remarry a non-Christian. This is the basis of the church's position throughout history, that we don't want couples to be unequally yoked. And so traditionally, up until maybe 50 years ago, the Orthodox Church required both spouses to be Orthodox in order to be married in the church. But in the last maybe 50 years or so, that started to change, so that the only requirement is an Orthodox has to marry a Christian baptized in the name of the Trinity. So but a Muslim or anyone not baptized in the name of Trinity, strictly forbidden, on the basis of Paul's teaching here, that once you're a Christian, if you want to get married or remarried, it should be in the Lord to a Christian. He's definite on that. but otherwise he allows some kind of wiggle room. Yeah.
Back home, if I may, many times they would not allow cousins to marry. And that was against the rule of the church. And yet in a small community, usually the first person that has the option to marry is the cousin, and he kind of had the first option to marry this girl. I don't know whether we took this from the biblical positions. I don't know. But a lot of times, because the church would not allow cousins to marry, they would actually join the Catholic Church, who would allow them to marry.
Really?
Or some of the Orthodox, or vice versa. It also happened, where where they were Catholics. I don't know how it was in the Catholic Church exactly, but often they would change from one church to another just so that they are able to marry.
Yeah, that sounds like the Middle East. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I'm a little bit surprised because at least the early church, the United Church, had common rules for this, but I guess it sounds like what you're saying is at some point the West relaxed the rules. But yeah, the church, even to this day, we have a canon forbidding marriage between people who are related up to the 6th degree, right? So up to 6th cousins are forbidden. If you're 7th cousins, it's okay, but up to 6th cousin, it's forbidden. And then the interesting thing is, on this note, that relation, so that's relation by blood. Relation by baptism, meaning if you baptized your friend's son, right, then you have this baptismal relationship that forbids marriage up to the 5th degree. Right. So if you, this is why it gets complicated. Sometimes people ask about, well, can I sponsor so-and-so in their wedding because I baptized so-and-so? It's because it's considered like almost up to the 5th, not the 6th, the 5th. So almost the same as an actual blood relation. And that's also forbidden. But it sounds like the Catholics relax that at some point. All right. So anyway, 40, just finishing up this last verse. But so he's talking about this woman whose husband dies. She can get remarried only to a Christian. But Paul again says, but she is happier, or would be happier, if she remains as she is, unmarried, widowed, according to my judgment, according to my opinion. I don't have this from Christ directly. This is my opinion, but he's saying this is my opinion. And I think I also have the Spirit of God, meaning that God has, like you said earlier, God has found me trustworthy. He's put me in this position to kind of adjudicate these issues and apply the principles. And this is my opinion. So, he doesn't say God said this, but he's saying, he's underlining it. This is my firm opinion on this. All right. So yeah, that's a really, 1 Corinthians 7 is an important chapter, especially for marriage. And then, so next time we'll do 8. It's only 13 verses. And again, he's talking about this food sacrificed to idols, and he's again going to try to find a nuanced position that avoids the extremes, right? So we'll talk about that next time. Anybody have any questions, comments about anything? I mean, everyone here is a woman. How does I'm curious if anyone wants to kind of comment or reflect on how you were brought up, whether in the Orthodox or another tradition, and how the teaching of Paul about marriage in chapter 7 sounds to you. Does it sound like what you've always been taught, or sounds normal? No,
I guess
I personally, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, I think to your point about becoming a monk or a nun is just very radical in our society. And like you said, it's not even a life option that even presents itself. And I remember there was someone who was like a couple of years younger than me at my church. I grew up Orthodox, was baptized as a baby, all that stuff. And people were even just shocked that he wanted to become a priest. And so I thought that was interesting too, that, it's not even like, a monk or a nun or anything like that, but just joining the priesthood. And our whole church, I think, was like, oh my gosh. And so, yeah, that was interesting to me. But I think as I kind of like I was never really exposed to any of the Protestant faiths really much growing up until I got to college and had, friends who are Protestant and things like that, and how much they value marriage and their pastors being married and sharing their marriage with like the congregation. And they had so many questions about like Orthodox priests and Catholic priests. They don't really think of them as separate, but just like, why they would not want to be married and those sorts of things. So that was something I didn't realize, I guess, till I actually got into college and met more people who are Protestant.
Yeah, I think, it's like I was trying to say earlier, it's one of these debates where in the West, they've each staked out these kind of extreme positions opposed to one another, like the Protestants. And I can see why it happened. I mean, I think St. Augustine, he is a saint of piety, but although the Orthodox Church doesn't accept all his teachings as authoritative, because he did, we would say, kind of misunderstand sexuality a little bit from our point of view, and led to maybe some negative attitudes towards sexuality that the Catholic Church staked out, insisting on the celibacy of the priests. And then the Protestants, of course, react to whether they view as an extreme, legitimately. And so then they go the other direction where it's like this anti-monasticism, anti-clericalism. And then this infects the interpretation and translation of chapters like what we're just reading. But really the Orthodox position is, kind of a step outside of this later debate and saying, Paul is not saying one or the other. He's giving you a nuanced position, acknowledging the goodness of that and the goodness of that, right? So it's not one or the other. And like too many times I feel like this is what happens in Western Christianity. And then I've always found Orthodoxy just so refreshing in that way, because these seemingly unsolvable paradoxes or whatever, the Orthodox come in and say, yeah, it's both, problem solved. So, that really is kind of the Orthodox mind, which I think we're going to see here. And I'll leave you with this, that there's this great, when we're talking about the rules, because we're going to come up against this next time with the eating of meat sacrificed to idols. The church has these rules they've developed over the years, judgments, opinions, called canons, which literally just means a rule. And the canons, there are many, many canons. They're all developed sometimes in a hypothetical way, but usually in a very particular, they're addressed to particular situations in history. But the canons are not, St. Paisios says the canons can't become canons to shoot the faithful. In other words, we can't use this use rules to harm people. The rules are there to help people. And so St. Justin Popovic, a modern Serbian saint, he says, and I think this is just beautiful, he says, I would give my life to preserve and protect even the most insignificant of the canons, so I would give my life to protect it. But he said, I would sacrifice all the canons to save one soul, right? So this is the Orthodox way of thinking. This is what you're going to see, I think, with Paul here. The rules, the traditions, not eating meat sacrificed to idol, like all these things that maybe people develop in their hearts as an expression of their piety in God. This is good, but it's not the thing itself. So anyway, all right. Well, thank you all.
Hi, Father.